Title: The Curse Begins. Chapter 1. The awakening. The storm raged over Hollow Creek, the small town nestled between darkened forests and mist-covered hills. Rain hammered against the rooftops, lightning illuminating the sky in flashes of electric blue. Beneath the fury of nature, a house stood at the edge of town, a house that had been abandoned for decades, untouched, rotting in silence. Until tonight, Sophia Carter never believed in curses. As a journalist, she sought facts, not whispers of folklore. But when she received an anonymous tip about the Blackwood house, she couldn't resist the lure of a new story. The message was simple: the house is waking up. Come before it's too late. Most would have dismissed it as a prank. But Sophia was different. She was drawn to mysteries like a moth to a flame. However, something about this message felt wrong. The number wasn't recognized when she tried to call it back. Instead, all she heard was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking from inside a hollow space. She had been having dreams, too. The same dream night after night. A dim hallway, a door at the end slightly ajar, and beyond it, a mirror reflecting something she could never quite see. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. By nightfall, she stood before the infamous house, its warped wooden exterior blackened by time. The storm howled around her, but something was worse. The front door was already open, swaying slightly, as if it had been expecting her. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Diary. Inside, the air was stale, thick with decay and forgotten time. Dust motes swirled in the dim light of her flashlight. Furniture, long abandoned, sat covered in ghostly white sheets. The floor groaned beneath her weight, as if protesting her intrusion. She moved deeper, camera in hand, snapping pictures of walls covered in strange symbols. At first glance, they seemed like meaningless scratches, but upon closer inspection, she saw patterns, shapes, and spirals that made her head ache to look at them. Then she found it. On the grand mahogany table in the parlor lay an old leather-bound book, its edges burned, its pages brittle. The journal belonged to Eleanor Blackwood, the last known resident of the house. The first pages were mundane, notes on daily life, mentions of her husband and young son. But then, the tone shifted. The walls whisper at night. I see figures moving in the corners. John says it's my imagination, but I know what I saw. They are watching. Sophia shuddered. She turned the pages. The mirror in the attic. It is not a mirror. It is a door. A door to something that should never be opened. A loud thud echoed from above. Chapter 3. The mirror in the attic. Her heart hammered. The attic? She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the top, a narrow hallway led to a single wooden door, slightly ajar. Inside, dust coated the forgotten relics of the past. Old trunks, faded paintings, broken furniture. But it was the mirror in the center that caught her attention. It was massive, Victorian, with a gilded frame carved with strange, twisting figures. The glass was impossibly dark, swallowing the dim light of her flashlight. She stepped closer. Her reflection did not move. Sophia stumbled back, her breath shallow. The figure in the mirror, her reflection, but not, tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement. Its lips parted in a smile that did not belong to her. Then the whispering began. A voice, feminine, ancient, amused. You found me. Her flashlight flickered, and for a fraction of a second, she saw it. A handprint smeared on the inside of the glass. Chapter 4. The possession. Sophia gasped, jerking away from the mirror. But the whispering didn't stop. You're just like her. Her hands trembled as she reached for her camera. The lens reflected the empty attic, but when she lowered it, the figure was still there, staring, smiling, waiting. The temperature plummeted. Her breath fogged in the air. The floor beneath her felt less solid, as though the wood had thinned into something else. Something alive. A sudden force yanked her towards the mirror. She screamed, clawing at the wooden floor, her fingers scraping against the dust-covered surface. The reflection reached out, hands extending from the glass, wrapping around her wrists with an unnatural grip. A gust of wind roared through the attic, scattering old papers and shaking the furniture. Sophia's body was lifted, her own reflection pulling her into the mirror, and then silence. Chapter 5. The other side. Sophia awoke in darkness. At first, she thought she was still in the attic, but then she noticed the eerie stillness. No sound, no warmth, just an endless, suffocating void. Then she saw it. The mirror was gone. Instead, she stood in an exact replica of the Blackwood house, but it was reversed. The furniture was wrong, the dust was gone, and the air carried a rotten scent. Everything was eerily pristine, yet unnatural. She moved to the hallway, her heart racing. A shadow flitted past the doorway, moving impossibly fast. A woman's laughter echoed around her. Sophia turned, and there she was, Eleanor Blackwood. She was no longer a photograph in an old journal. She was here, and she was waiting. "You don't belong here," Eleanor whispered, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "But now you can't leave." Sophia's blood ran cold. She turned to run, but the hallway stretched infinitely before her. The shadows closed in, swallowing the dim light of the cursed world she had entered. And in the real world, the mirror in the attic stood silent once more, its surface now reflecting nothing at all. To be continued. Title: The Curse Deepens, Chapter 1. The other side. Darkness stretched infinitely in every direction. Sophia Carter's breath came in ragged gasps as she turned in circles, trying to grasp the reality of where she was. The Blackwood house stood around her, but it was wrong. The walls were too smooth, the air too heavy, as if gravity itself pressed harder in this twisted reflection of the world she had known. She touched the wall, cold, slick, and pulsing beneath her fingers. It felt like skin stretched too tight over unseen bones. A whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." Sophia spun around. Shadows slithered across the floor, merging with the darkness pooling at her feet. From the corner of the room, Eleanor Blackwood emerged, her form elongated, her eyes hollow black pits, her smile too wide. "You're just like the others," Eleanor murmured, tilting her head. "Trapped, alone, forgotten." Sophia stepped back, pulse pounding. "I'm not staying here." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her fingers twitched. "They all say that at first." Then the shadows lunged. Chapter 2. The shifting house. The darkness wrapped around Sophia's legs like ink made flesh, dragging her toward Eleanor. She struggled, kicking wildly, her screams swallowed by the void surrounding them. She reached for anything solid, and her fingers brushed against something in her pocket. The small silver pendant her mother had given her years ago, a family heirloom said to protect against evil. With a desperate gasp, she clutched it tight and pressed it against the shadows. A burst of searing light erupted from her palm. Eleanor let out a shriek, recoiling as the shadows hissed and burned away. Sophia scrambled to her feet and ran, crashing through the door and down the twisted, endless hallways of this reverse Blackwood house. But the house was alive. The hallways twisted and rearranged themselves as she ran. Doors vanished. Staircases stretched endlessly into the darkness. She turned a corner and found herself back where she started. The house wasn't letting her go. A painting on the wall caught her attention. Her own face, staring back at her in horror. The frame was old and cracked, as if she had always been here. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. Chapter 3. Eleanor's truth. Eleanor appeared in front of her again. This time less human, more shadow than flesh. But her expression wasn't just malice. It was something else. Regret. "You don't understand," Eleanor whispered. "I didn't choose this. The mirror needs a soul." Sophia's stomach clenched. "A soul? I was the first," Eleanor said. "Pulled in by my own curiosity, just like you. The mirror, it doesn't just take. It feeds. And once it has you, it never lets you go. Unless," Sophia swallowed hard, "unless someone takes your place." Eleanor's smile was bitter. "Now you understand." A sharp pain shot through Sophia's wrist. She looked down, a dark bruise, the shape of a handprint, forming on her skin. Eleanor had the same mark. The house had chosen her. Chapter 4. The mirror's toll. Sophia sprinted toward the mirror, her feet barely touching the warped floor. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and she saw her reflection, her real reflection, standing on the other side, reaching for her. She lunged. A cold hand seized her wrist. "Eleanor, you can't leave," Eleanor whispered, her grip tightening. "Not without leaving something behind." Sophia's reflection screamed silently, mirroring her terror. The surface of the mirror began to fracture, spiderweb cracks splintering outward. She had to choose, stay and become part of this realm, or break free at a terrible cost. With a strangled cry, Sophia pressed the pendant to Eleanor's chest. A blinding white flame erupted, consuming Eleanor's form. The shadows writhed and shrieked, recoiling as Eleanor's grip loosened. The mirror trembled. Sophia had mere seconds to escape. Ignoring the searing pain in her limbs, she flung herself forward. The mirror's surface shattered around her, slicing through her skin as she tumbled through. The air was different, lighter, warmer. She was back. Chapter 5. The aftermath. Sophia gasped, rolling onto the cold wooden floor of the Blackwood attic. The broken shards of the mirror lay scattered around her, reflecting pieces of her terrified face. But something was wrong. Her breath hitched as she noticed a dark silhouette in the shards, a shape watching from the fractured realm. A whisper. "You didn't close the door." The attic door slammed shut, and the shadows began to move again. Sophia clutched her wrist. The bruise had not faded. In the remaining shards of the mirror, her reflection did not move. To be continued. Fred's Chapter 1. The lingering mark. Sophia Carter sat in the dim glow of her apartment, staring at the bruise on her wrist. It hadn't faded. Instead, it had darkened into an inky black, spreading like veins beneath her skin. The events of Blackwood House had left her shaken, but she had convinced herself it was over, that she had escaped. But the mark told her otherwise. She tried covering it with makeup. The darkness seeped through. She wrapped it in bandages, but the skin burned beneath them, as though rejecting her attempt to hide it. Then the whispers started again. They began softly, like a draft passing through an open window. Then they grew louder. At night, they slithered through her ears, forming words she couldn't quite make out. But she knew what they meant. "You brought it with you." Her reflection in the mirror had begun to feel foreign. Some nights, she would catch it watching her. Other times, she would see herself moving slightly out of sync, like an old video with lagging frames. Then there was the time she saw her reflection blink, when she hadn't. She wasn't alone. Chapter 2. The stranger who knew. Desperate for answers, Sophia sought out those who studied the occult. She scoured online forums, libraries, anywhere that spoke of curses, mirrors, and lingering spirits. Most of what she found were half-baked legends and urban myths. But one name kept appearing: Dr. Elias Wren. A scholar of paranormal afflictions, Wren was rumored to have experience with things most people refused to believe in. She found him in a dusty old bookstore, hidden beneath stacks of forgotten knowledge. His eyes flickered with understanding the moment she showed him her wrist. "This is not just a curse," he murmured, his fingers grazing the mark. "It's a tether. A piece of you is still inside that house. And worse, something else has come back with you." Sophia's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" Wren hesitated, then gestured to a cracked mirror on the wall. "Look." She turned slowly, and there, in the glass, her reflection smiled back at her. But her lips had not moved. Chapter 3. The other self. The thing in the mirror was not her. It mimicked her movements, but with the slightest delay, as if deciding what she would do next. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers buried deep in a dying fire. Then it spoke. "You didn't close the door." Sophia staggered back, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Wren grabbed her shoulder, his grip firm. "It's trying to take your place. That mark isn't just a scar. It's an invitation." The reflection's lips curled. "You belong with us now." The light in the room flickered. The shadows pooled at her feet, climbing up her legs like living tendrils. Wren murmured something in Latin, tossing a handful of salt toward the mirror. The reflection screamed silently, the glass splintering before the image vanished. Sophia gasped for breath. What the hell was that? Wren's face was grim. "The only way to end this is to sever the connection. We need to go back to Blackwood House. And this time, you must destroy the mirror completely." Sophia swallowed hard. She had sworn never to return. But if she didn't, she knew the next time she looked in the mirror, it wouldn't be her staring back. Chapter 4. The return to Blackwood House. The house was exactly as she left it. Silent, decayed, waiting. The wind howled through its broken windows, carrying whispers she had hoped never to hear again. The moment she stepped inside, the bruise on her wrist burned, sending a sharp pain up her arm. "It knows I'm here." Wren moved swiftly, setting up a protective circle of salt. We need to act fast. The mirror's power grows the longer it remains unbroken. Sophia's breath fogged in the air as she moved toward the attic. The darkness inside felt thicker, suffocating. She knew what awaited her at the top. The mirror stood where she had last seen it, though now its cracks had sealed. The surface gleamed, beckoning her forward, and in its reflection stood Eleanor. Chapter 5. The final confrontation. Eleanor's presence was stronger now. No longer a fleeting shadow, but something solid. Something hungry. "You came back," Eleanor whispered. "You should have stayed away." Sophia clenched her fists. "I want my life back." Eleanor's laugh was cold. "You don't get to choose. The mirror has already decided." The shadows surged, wrapping around Sophia's ankles. Her reflection in the mirror stepped forward, emerging from the glass with a sickening ripple. It reached for her, its touch freezing, unnatural. Ren shouted an incantation, but the mirror fought back, pulsing with dark energy that sent him flying against the wall. The reflection grinned, its teeth too sharp, its eyes void of humanity. Sophia had only one chance. She grabbed a jagged shard of the broken floorboard and plunged it into the mirror's heart. Piercing shriek filled the attic. The glass exploded, shards flying in all directions as the world around them shook violently. The shadows writhed, collapsing into themselves. Eleanor let out one final, desperate wail before vanishing into the void. Her form pulled back into the shattered remains of the mirror. Sophia barely had time to react before the house began to collapse. Chapter 6. The price of freedom. She didn't remember how she and Ren made it out. The next thing she knew, they were outside, the first light of dawn breaking over the ruins of Blackwood House. Smoke and dust rose into the sky as the cursed structure finally fell. She looked at her wrist. The bruise was gone. Ren exhaled heavily. "It's over." Sophia wanted to believe him. She really did. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in a shard of broken glass by her feet. Her reflection was still smiling. And as she blinked, it didn't. To be continued. Title: The Reflections Whisper. Chapter 1. A hollow victory. The shattered glass of the mirror still lay scattered around Sophia's feet, each shard reflecting something different. Distorted versions of herself, shifting like ripples on a dark lake. Her hands trembled as she turned to Dr. Ren, whose face was etched with exhaustion. "It's done," he said, brushing dust off his coat. "The house is collapsing. We should go." Sophia nodded, though something gnawed at her from the inside. The air was too still. The house should have been screaming as it died, but instead, it was silent. A thick, suffocating silence. As they stepped away from the ruins of Blackwood House, she felt an odd sensation, like an invisible thread pulling at her wrist. She glanced down, expecting to see the bruise gone. It was, but something else had replaced it. A faint imprint of a hand, pale and translucent, just beneath her skin. She swallowed hard and turned away. If she ignored it, perhaps it would disappear. Perhaps it was nothing. She was wrong. Chapter 2. The watching glass. Sophia tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. Every time she passed a reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even puddles, she hesitated. Sometimes, she saw nothing unusual. Other times, she saw something else entirely. The first time it happened was in the bathroom. She had turned on the light and caught her reflection staring at her, lips moving though she had said nothing. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as days passed, they grew stronger, more urgent. "You didn't break the mirror. You only opened the door wider." Sophia pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't stop. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside her head. And worse, she started seeing reflections of herself where they shouldn't be. In the darkened TV screen, in car windows as she walked by. Once, she saw herself in a store's security camera feed. Only her reflection wasn't mirroring her movements. It was waving. Chapter 3. Dr. Ren's secret desperation drove her back to Dr. Ren, who had retreated to his study in the city, buried in dusty tomes and forgotten knowledge. His face paled when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, leading her inside and locking the door behind them. "It's not over, is it?" She shook her head. "I see things in mirrors. I hear whispers. And this?" She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the spectral handprint. "What is happening to me?" Ren sighed, rubbing his temples. I was afraid of this. He moved to a bookshelf, pulling down a worn leather-bound volume. He flipped through the pages until he landed on an image that made Sophia's blood run cold. It was a sketch of Eleanor Blackwood, but next to it was another figure, one that looked like her. There's a pattern, Ren explained. The mirror doesn't just take, chooses. Eleanor wasn't the first. And you might not be the last. Sophia's mouth went dry. You knew this would happen? I suspected, Ren admitted, but I had to let you break the mirror. I needed to know if the cycle would end. Her stomach twisted. So you used me. I tried to save you, he corrected, and I still can, but you have to trust me. Sophia wasn't sure she did, but she had no choice. Chapter 4. The twin in the mirror that night. She dreamt of the mirror. She stood in a grand hallway lined with ornate glass, each mirror stretching endlessly. But in the center was a single full-length mirror, unbroken, pristine. Her reflection stood inside it, waiting. You have to come back. Sophia shook her head. No, I destroyed you. Her reflection tilted its head. Did you? The glass rippled. Hands reached out from within, fingers curling around the edges of the frame. You don't belong here, Sophia. Not yet. She woke up screaming, her breath ragged. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a chorus. Chapter 5. The return to Blackwood. Sophia knew there was only one thing left to do. She had to go back. The house was gone, but the land remained. And whatever was waiting for her was still there. Dr. Wren was reluctant but agreed. Together, they drove through the misty roads until the ruins of Blackwood House came into view. Only there were no ruins. The house stood as it always had, untouched by time, its windows gleaming under the moonlight. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. That's impossible. Wren's grip tightened on the steering wheel. No, it's exactly what I expected. They stepped out of the car, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The front door stood slightly ajar as if inviting them in. Sophia hesitated. Then she stepped inside. Chapter 6. The final choice. The house was alive. The walls pulsed like breathing flesh. Shadows slithered across the ceiling, curling towards Sophia like hungry tendrils. And at the end of the hallway, the mirror waited. It was whole. Eleanor stood before it, her face twisted into something almost human. Almost? You should have come sooner, she said. Now it's too late. Sophia's chest tightened. I broke the mirror. Eleanor's expression darkened. You broke a mirror? But the real one? The first one? It was never in that house. Sophia's blood turned to ice. Then where is it? Eleanor smiled. Inside you. The house shuddered, walls cracking as glass burst forth from the floor like jagged teeth. The whispers turned to wails. The reflection in the mirror grinned and stepped forward. Wren shouted something, tossing a vial of something burning white into the air. The shadows shrieked, but Eleanor did not flinch. Sophia realized the truth too late. She had never left. Her body was still inside the mirror. And the thing standing outside? It was the one she had been running from all along. To be continued. Title: Into the Mirror's Abyss. Chapter 1. The truth unveiled. Sophia stood frozen, her breath hitching in her throat. The walls of Blackwood House pulsed around her like a living organism, whispering, groaning, watching. She turned to Wren, expecting him to mirror her horror. Instead, he simply stared at the mirror, his face void of emotion. You knew, she whispered, a bitter realization settling in. You knew I never actually left. Wren let out a slow breath, as if choosing his words carefully. I suspected, he admitted, but I needed to be sure. And now, his eyes flickered to the ornate mirror standing pristine at the end of the corridor, its surface rippling like dark water. Now we know. Sophia clenched her fists, rage bubbling beneath her skin. You used me, she spat, like a damn experiment. Wren's expression softened, but before he could reply, the whispers surged around them. The walls trembled, and Sophia's reflection in the mirror moved on its own. Then it smiled. You're home now. Chapter 2. The other side. Sophia's body tensed as the mirror's surface split open like the mouth of some eldritch creature. A force pulled at her, an invisible grip dragging her forward. She clawed at the floor, at Wren, at anything solid, but the reflection's grin widened as its hands reached through the glass. A moment later, she was gone. The world shifted. She fell endlessly through darkness. It wasn't the kind of darkness found in unlit rooms or midnight streets. It was a consuming void, thick and suffocating. Whispers curled around her like cold fingers, pressing into her skin, into her skull. Then suddenly she landed. She gasped, blinking rapidly. The air smelled stale, damp, familiar. Blackwood House stood before her, but something was wrong. The structure was the same, yet it wasn't. The sky overhead was a void of swirling shadows, and the ground beneath her wasn't solid, but a reflection of the house itself. She turned and faced the mirror behind her. Ren was still in the real world, his expression conflicted. "Get me out of here!" she screamed, slamming her fists against the glass. Ren hesitated. And then he walked away. Chapter 3. The Hollow One. Sophia backed away from the mirror, cold dread settling in her gut. She was trapped. The house creaked and groaned, as though sensing her presence. Then, from the hallway, she heard the faintest sound, footsteps. She turned slowly. Figures moved in the darkness, shifting silhouettes with hollow, featureless faces. They watched her, their heads tilting unnaturally, bodies twitching with inhuman movement. One of them stepped forward. It had her shape. Sophia staggered back. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't real." The figure mirrored her, its movements slightly delayed, as if learning how to mimic her. Then it spoke in her voice. "You don't belong here. But you never really belonged out there either." She turned and ran. Chapter 4. The prison of glass. Sophia raced through the house, her breath ragged. The rooms shifted as she moved, doors leading to different hallways, furniture rearranging itself with each turn. The house was alive. She stumbled into the library and slammed the door behind her, chest rising and falling in quick gasps. The candlelight flickered, and the bookshelves towered around her like prison bars. Then, a voice, a familiar one. "You always knew, deep down." Sophia whirled around. Eleanor Blackwood sat in the high-backed chair by the fireplace, gazing at her with unsettling calm. "Why are you doing this?" Sophia demanded. "Why bring me here?" Eleanor tilted her head. "I didn't bring you. You brought yourself." Sophia shook her head. "That's not true. I broke the mirror." Eleanor chuckled, a hollow, humorless sound. "Did you?" She gestured toward the bookshelf, and as Sophia turned, her stomach dropped. Every single book's cover was a reflection of herself. Different versions, some familiar, some not. One book lay open on the desk. It showed Sophia walking into Blackwood House. Her head pounded, reality twisted. Had she ever left? Chapter 5. The final choice. Eleanor rose from the chair. "You have two choices," she said. "Stay here and let the house claim you, or take your place back in the real world." Sophia clenched her fists. "How?" Eleanor smiled. "You already know." A mirror materialized before them. On the other side, Ren stood in his study, flipping through a book. He hadn't left her. He was studying her. And in the background, Sophia saw herself. Not trapped, not banging on glass, living. She was already in the real world. Her breath hitched. "That's not me." Eleanor nodded. "She took your place." Sophia's mind reeled. It was never about escaping. It was about which version of her got to exist. "I can't let her have my life." Eleanor's smile widened. "Then take it back." Sophia stepped forward. Chapter 6. The reflection breaks. The moment Sophia touched the mirror, a shockwave of energy pulsed through her. The world shattered, fragments of glass raining down around her as she was ripped from the in-between. She gasped awake. She was in Ren's study. He stared at her, caught off guard. Sophia didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest shard of glass and lunged at the other Sophia. The imposter barely had time to react before Sophia plunged the glass into her chest. A scream, inhuman, agonized, pierced the room. The imposter's form flickered, distorting, before shattering into a million pieces. Sophia collapsed, gasping for air. Ren watched in stunned silence. "It really was you." Sophia looked at him, her eyes cold. "It was always me." The mirrors in the room cracked, and somewhere in the distance, Eleanor's voice laughed. Epilogue. What remains. Sophia sat by the window of her apartment, watching her own reflection in the glass. It didn't move, not on its own. She exhaled, relieved. Then her reflection smiled. Behind her, Dr. Ren whispered, "You think you really made it out?" To be continued. Title: Through the Shattered Veil. Chapter 1. The cracks in reality. Sophia sat motionless in her apartment, staring at the window. The city skyline reflected in the glass, and for the first time in weeks, she was afraid to look at her own reflection. The events at Blackwood House had left scars deeper than any wound. Eleanor was gone. The imposter had been destroyed. She had reclaimed her life. Or so she thought. Dr. Wren's final words haunted her. "You think you really made it out?" Every night since returning, the shadows in her room seemed too dark, as if they weren't simply the absence of light, but something else. Watching. Waiting. Her reflection in the mirror behaved normally, but when she turned away, she felt its lingering gaze. And then, 3 days after she returned, the first crack appeared. A thin, jagged line in the mirror of her bathroom. A hairline fracture that hadn't been there the night before. She pressed her fingers against the crack. It was cold. Colder than glass should be. And then she heard it. A whisper. "You left something behind." Sophia recoiled, heart pounding. The voice wasn't Eleanor's. It wasn't hers. It was something else. Something worse. Chapter 2. The mark of the hollow. Sophia tried to ignore the crack in the mirror, but the more she avoided it, the more the feeling of unease grew. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone. She stood in front of her full-length mirror one evening, exhausted but unable to turn away. Her eyes traced the reflection, scanning for something, anything out of place. It was just her, until she lifted her hand. Her reflection hesitated. It was just for a fraction of a second, but she saw it. Her stomach twisted as she watched herself move, everything slightly delayed. Then, as if realizing she had noticed, her reflection snapped back into sync. Sophia stumbled away from the mirror, while rising in her throat. She rolled up her sleeve. The faint imprint of a hand was still there, just beneath her skin. A remnant from the world inside the mirror. A mark of the hollow. And then her phone rang. She nearly screamed at the sudden noise before fumbling to answer. "Hello? I need you to come back." Dr. Wren's voice crackled over the line. Sophia gritted her teeth. "I don't want anything to do with you." "You don't have a choice," Wren said. "The mirror is still open. And if you don't close it, something else will come through." Chapter 3. A door left open reluctantly. Sophia returned to Wren's study. The air was thick with the scent of burnt sage and old parchment. Books lined the shelves, many of them too old, too obscure. He looked worse than before, dark circles under his eyes, his clothes disheveled. "I thought we destroyed it," Sophia said, arms crossed. Wren shook his head. "You shattered one mirror. But you didn't break the connection. That's why the cracks are appearing." He placed a small, ornate hand mirror on the table between them. The glass was intact, but when Sophia looked at it, her reflection wasn't there. "This is where it leads," Wren said. "This is your doorway back in." Sophia stared at the mirror, her breath shallow. "Back into that place?" "You don't have a choice," Wren said grimly. "Something else has already come through. If you don't return and seal it, it won't stop at just watching." Sophia clenched her fists. She had fought to escape once before. Could she do it again? But she knew the answer. She picked up the mirror, and the world ripped apart. Chapter 4. The Hollow Ones returned. Sophia fell through the void, the sensation of gravity twisting as reality inverted. The air was thick, suffocating. When she landed, she recognized the setting immediately. Blackwood House? But it was worse than before. The walls pulsed as if alive. The floors were covered in broken glass, each shard reflecting a different version of herself, some familiar, others grotesque. And then they stepped forward. The Hollow Ones. Figures without faces, without identity, drifting toward her in silence. Their movements were erratic, like marionettes controlled by unseen hands. Sophia backed away. "I don't belong here." One of them cocked its head. Then, in her own voice, it whispered, "Neither do we." Then they attacked. Chapter 5. The Reflections bargained. Sophia fought her way through the house, dodging grasping hands and shadowed figures. Every hallway led to another impossible corridor, doors opening into places that shouldn't exist. And then she saw it. The grand mirror. Unbroken. Waiting. But standing before it was herself. No. Not her. The other her. The reflection turned, smiling. "You came back." Sophia gritted her teeth. "I came to finish this." Her reflection tilted its head. "You never understood, did you? This was never about you escaping. It was about balance." The reflection lifted its hand. "A soul must stay." Sophia's chest tightened. "No." The reflection stepped through the mirror, and Sophia was pulled in. Chapter 6. The other side. Sophia gasped, hands pressing against the glass. She was inside the mirror. Outside, her reflection stretched its fingers, flexing them as if trying them on. She turned and smiled at Wren. "She made her choice," the imposter said. Sophia screamed, slamming her fists against the glass. "No, I'm the real one." The imposter leaned close. "They all say that." Sophia watched in horror as Wren did nothing. He only smiled. Then he reached forward and shattered the mirror. The world went black. Epilogue: What watches in the glass in the real world? Sophia, or what looked like her, walked out of Ren's study and into the city streets. The night air was crisp, and she breathed it in, a smile playing on her lips. She passed by a shop window and glanced at her reflection. It didn't move, it just watched. And deep inside the broken void of the mirror, Sophia screamed. To be continued. Title: Echoes in the Glass, Chapter 1. A world of shadows. Sophia awoke to silence. A deafening, unnatural silence that pressed against her skin like a suffocating veil. Her fingers curled against the cold floor, a smooth glass-like surface that reflected only darkness. She sat up abruptly, breath hitching in her throat. She was still inside. The mirror had sealed her in, but this was no mere reflection of the real world. This was something else, a fractured echo of reality, where the walls whispered and the air felt thick with unspoken words. Everything was distorted, warped as if viewed through water. Sophia pushed herself to her feet, glancing around. Blackwood House stood around her, but it wasn't her Blackwood House. The angles were sharper, the hallways longer, and the doors led to places they shouldn't. Then she heard it, a voice. "You don't belong here." Her head snapped toward the sound. A shadowed figure stood at the end of the hallway, its form flickering like a dying candle. And then it moved toward her. Chapter 2. The Hollow Ones Stir. Sophia ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move. The figure behind her followed, gliding rather than walking, its hollow eyes locked onto her. Doors slammed as she passed, sealing off escape routes. The house was alive, shifting, closing in on her. She threw herself into a room at the end of the hallway and slammed the door. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed her back against the wood. Then, a whisper from inside the room. "You're not the first." She spun, and her breath caught in her throat. A woman stood near the far wall, half hidden in shadows. She was dressed in a tattered nightgown, her hair falling in loose, tangled strands over her pale face. Sophia swallowed. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head. "I was Eleanor, once." Sophia's blood ran cold. Eleanor? But Eleanor took a step forward, and Sophia saw it. The translucent quality of her skin, the way she flickered at the edges. She wasn't alive. "You have to leave," Eleanor whispered, "before you forget who you are. Before you become one of them." Chapter 3. The Forgotten Ones. Eleanor led Sophia through the twisting corridors of the fractured Blackwood House. With every step, the walls trembled as if resisting their movement. The house wanted her to stay. "How long have you been here?" Sophia asked. "Long enough," Eleanor murmured. "Time doesn't work here. Twists, it loops. If you don't find your way out soon, you'll forget." Sophia frowned. "Forget what?" Eleanor stopped at a mirror, its surface cracked but still reflective. "Yourself." Sophia stepped closer, staring at her own reflection. But something was wrong. The longer she looked, the less it looked like her. Her features blurred, warped, her hair darkened, her skin paled. Her eyes weren't hers anymore. Her reflection's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. "It's already happening," Eleanor whispered. "Your face won't be your own for much longer." Sophia stumbled back. "No, that's not real." Eleanor grabbed her arm. "You have to stop it, or soon you'll be one of them. A hollow one." Chapter 4. The reflections trap. A loud creak echoed through the house. The shadows trembled. The hollow ones were coming. "We need to go," Eleanor urged. Sophia followed her, heart hammering. "How do we get out?" Eleanor hesitated. "There's only one way, but it requires a sacrifice." Sophia's stomach twisted. "What kind of sacrifice?" "A life for a life," Eleanor whispered. "The only way to leave is to trade places with someone else." Sophia stopped. "You mean—" "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice filled with quiet sorrow. "Someone on the other side has to take your place." Sophia's thoughts reeled. Was this how her reflection had escaped? Had someone else been trapped in her place? A sudden thought sent ice through her veins. Had Ren known? Had he planned this? The house shook violently. Time was running out. Chapter 5. The impossible choice. They reached the grand mirror, the one still intact. The one that led back to the real world. Sophia's reflection was already there, waiting, smiling, mocking. "Are you ready to trade?" it asked softly. Sophia clenched her fists. "No, I'm taking my life back." The reflection tilted its head. You don't have a choice. A balance must be maintained. Someone must stay. Eleanor's grip tightened on Sophia's wrist. Don't listen to it. You can break the cycle. Sophia's mind spun. If she took her place, someone else would be trapped. But then she thought of Ren, the one who had put her here, the one who had known all along. Her decision solidified. I know who will take my place. Chapter 6. The exchange. Sophia reached out toward the mirror, but not for her reflection. Instead, she whispered a name. Ren. The moment the word left her lips, the air shifted. The house groaned in protest. The shadows trembled. Ren's form materialized in the mirror's surface, his expression going from curiosity to shock. What are you? The mirror pulled him in. Sophia felt the force push her forward, shoving her out of the mirror as Ren's screams echoed through the house. And then the mirror shattered. Epilogue. What remained? Sophia opened her eyes. She was back, in the real world. She gasped, stumbling back against Ren's desk. The office was exactly as she remembered, but something felt different. She turned to the mirror. It was broken now, shards glinting in the dim light. And in the largest remaining fragment, she saw Ren's face. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His hands pounded against the glass. Trapped, Sophia let out a slow breath. Balance must be maintained, she whispered. She turned away, leaving the broken mirror behind. But as she stepped into the hallway, she caught her own reflection in another glass pane. And for the briefest moment, it smiled back. To be continued. Title: The Final Reflection. Chapter 1. The Haunting Truth. Sophia stood motionless, her breath shallow as she stared at her reflection in the broken mirror. The fractured shards reflected distorted versions of herself, each piece revealing something different, a slight smile here, a cold stare there. But in the largest shard, Ren was still trapped. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His hands pressed against the glass, desperation in his eyes. She had done it. She had escaped. But something felt off. The world around her was too quiet. The air too still. She turned away from the mirror, but her own reflection did not follow. Instead, it lingered, its eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite human. Then it smiled. A slow, deliberate curl of the lips that sent icy dread crawling down Sophia's spine. You're still in it, the reflection whispered. Sophia staggered back, shaking her head. No, that was impossible. She had returned. She had won. Hadn't she? Chapter 2. The cracks in reality. Desperation clawed at her mind as she ran through Ren's study, past the bookshelves, the dimly lit lamps, the thick scent of aged parchment. Everything seemed normal except for the fact that it wasn't. She reached the front door, throwing it open, only to find herself back in the study. Sophia's heart pounded. She turned, sprinting toward the window, but the same thing happened. The moment she stepped through, she reappeared inside the study, standing right where she started. She was trapped. A chill ran through her as she realized she had never really left the mirror. Then, from behind her, she heard a voice she should never have heard again. You thought you were free? Ren's voice drawled, amused, from the mirror. Sophia spun around. The reflection of Ren inside the glass was no longer panicked. It was grinning, mocking. You see, Sophia, you never truly left, Ren continued. That's the game. The hollow ones never let their prey escape. They only let you think you have. Sophia swallowed hard. That means the real world is still waiting for you. But you, Ren smirked. You're still here. With us. Chapter 3. The hollow ones returned. Sophia ran to the mirror, slamming her fists against the cold glass. Let me out, she screamed. You can't keep me here. But Ren only shook his head. Oh, but we can. And now that you're here. He paused, watching her with dark amusement. They're coming. The temperature plummeted. From the corners of the study, shadows began to slither forward. They were featureless, humanoid silhouettes that moved without sound, their heads tilting unnaturally as they watched her. The hollow ones. Sophia's breath hitched. No, not again. They advanced with slow, deliberate movements, surrounding her, enclosing her in an ever-tightening circle. The whispers began, low at first, a rustling murmur that built into an unbearable crescendo inside her skull. And then a hand gripped her wrist. Sophia gasped, jerking away, but the hand belonged to Eleanor. Chapter 4. The Last Door. Eleanor looked at her with pleading eyes. There's still a way out, she whispered. But you have to move. Now. Sophia hesitated until she saw the hollow ones closing in. Eleanor pulled her, leading her down the twisting halls of the house, corridors that stretched and warped like a living organism. Doors appeared and disappeared, shifting with every step. The whispers grew louder. "What is this?" Sophia asked breathlessly as they ran. "The mirror world is collapsing," Eleanor said. "They won't let you go without a fight. But there's one door they can't control." Ahead, at the end of the endless corridor, stood a door unlike the others, a tall, black frame that pulsed like it was breathing. A final exit. Eleanor stopped in front of it, turning to Sophia. "This door leads to reality, but you can only go through if you leave something behind." Sophia's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "A soul for a soul," Eleanor whispered. "That's the rule. One of us stays. One of us goes." Sophia froze. Eleanor smiled sadly. "I've been here too long, Sophia. I don't even remember what my real face looks like anymore. But you? You still have time." Tears burned at the edges of Sophia's eyes. "Eleanor, I go," Eleanor urged, stepping back as the hollow ones came closer. "Before it's too late." Sophia clenched her fists. She didn't want to leave Eleanor behind, but if she stayed any longer, she wouldn't be herself anymore. She turned toward the door and jumped through. Chapter 5. The shattered illusion. Pain exploded in Sophia's skull as she hit the floor. The air was thick, pressing against her lungs. She gasped for breath and opened her eyes to find herself back in Ren's office. Her hands pressed against the floor. Solid. Real. She was back. She turned toward the mirror, what was left of it. Cracked. Destroyed. And in the shattered reflection, she saw Eleanor. Eleanor smiled, raising a hand to the glass. But she wasn't sad. She was free. And then, the shards fell apart, and Eleanor's image disappeared. Sophia sat there for a long time, trying to steady her breath. It was over, wasn't it? Epilogue. The echoes remained. Days later, Sophia sat in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the window. The city stretched out beyond her, bustling and alive. But something inside her felt different. She reached up, pressing her fingers to the glass. Her reflection mirrored her, but for a split second, just long enough for doubt to bloom. She thought she saw Eleanor's eyes staring back at her. She blinked, and it was gone. Was she truly free, or had something else come back in her place? As the sun set behind the city skyline, Sophia whispered to herself, "Balance must be maintained," and this time the voice did not sound like hers. The end.